Empress Elisabeth of Austria lived and died the way that spawned many stories and evoked the imagination of both her contemporaries and those who far outlived her. She was the subject of much press and paparazzi curiosity, and until now, there have been countless books, films, TV series about her. As someone who don't speak the German language, or any in that proximity though, I have only barely heard of her. Frankly, English-speaking media is much more interested in the other Elisabeth, spelled with a Z. So my first proper introduction to the Empress of Austria was a musical originally written by Michael Kunze and composed by Sylvester Levay, named Elisabeth the Musical. It was written as a deconstruction of the Elisabeth myth by exploring her chronic depression personified by the character Death, sometimes referred to as Elisabeth's lover, and the highly unglamorous period in history which she lived. But again, because the only brush I ever had with German-speaking culture was the good music of Beethoven, the wise words of Karl Marx, and the grim fairy tales, I am ashamed to say that I first watched the show via its Japanese version, specifically the one performed by the Takarazuka Revue company. And to tell the truth, it was completely lost on me. I really couldn't understand why this woman's name was the title of the show. Sure, she's played by the assigned top musumeyaku, but she seems to just lifelessly move through her own show. There's nothing she does that has any clear reason or motive. None of her actions have notable consequences, and I never felt like I learned anything new about the Empress of Austria, just that she was married at 16, to whom was originally betrothed to her sister, and probably struggled with depression. All the things I could have gotten from reading her Wikipedia. See, one of the reasons I like fictionalized and dramatized pieces about history is because they usually offer not the truth, but a perspective or interpretation of a historical event, era, or figure. With Elisabeth, Empress of Austria, the Takarazuka Revue didn't really tell me anything. Or rather, they told me that Elisabeth wasn't all that interesting. She didn't have any hobbies, except traveling. She didn't really do much, nor was that important. Surely she didn't have any intense and profound ideas or struggles that she may have noted down and demonstrated her poetic prowess. She was just there, in a story that didn't need her. And that is beyond strange because if she wasn't all that interesting, why make a musical about her? If I were a completely unlearned audience who neither knew nor cared about Elisabeth, I probably wouldn't have given this show a second thought. The costumes were great, the choreography is nice, and Asaka Manato is hot as fuck, but ultimately it was massively underwhelming. But I had an inkling that there had to be more, because there were fragments of the show that would have made a brilliant story that felt like they weren't followed through. So I looked up the Viennese version, more specifically the Vienna revival cast from 2003 to 2005, and oh boy, it hit me like a big yellow school bus, because things for once make complete sense. Initially, I foolishly pinned the blame on the Takarazuka Revue's musumeyaku for playing Elisabeth too innocent and childlike, which was mean, and I'm embarrassed to even admit it, because first of all, you're only as good as you're directed to act, but more importantly, on closer examination, not even Pia Daos or Maya Hakfur could have given Zukabeth a spine. Certainly, I am not the first person to notice this. So, what is the cause of Elisabeth's downgrade from the Empress of Austria to walking cardboard? I'm not interested in discussing the culture of Takarazuka Revue and their, depending on how see it, queerness or lack thereof, which I understand is a popular theme regarding this topic. Those kinds of discussions would require encompassing knowledge of many Takarazuka Revue productions, as well as a familiarity with the inner workings of the company and its very, very large fandom. I am only interested in this particular musical and production, and in order to understand the differences in the story, I believe we must look to the differences between this very crucial factor of a musical, the music. Most people tend to think of musicals as a simple fairy tale where characters randomly break into songs. This format, where each moment of exposition, expression, and emotional intensity is depicted through song, is popular for many musicals. Most famously, many Disney animated features follow this format. For example, Belle is about Belle expressing her love for daydreaming and reading, while everybody else is confused by her. Be Our Guest is a spectacle to establish the fantastical setting that the story is going to take place in for basically the rest of the film. Beauty and the Beast describes the journey that Belle and the Beast took to come to bond and respect each other. These songs have one singular moment in the story that they represent, making them memorable and iconic. Overall, they don't have much connective tissue with one another. Each of them stand on their own. Sometimes a thematically significant piece of music may be reprised at the ending to reinforce the theme or just to offer some narrative closure. However, sometimes a musical number is so grand because it's not just about one singular moment, it's part of the story itself.
When's it my turn? Wouldn't I love? But I know something's starting right now. Just be like me. And I can be.
Part of Your World is Ariel's I Want song. Perhaps one of the most brilliant to come out of Disney too. It is a song about Ariel's intense desires and aspiration to escape the mundane life under the ocean and explore the world that she has grown extraordinarily curious about, to be accepted, a part of the world that's different, much like herself. Throughout the story, it is Ariel's aspiration that drives it forward, from going near Eric's ship to saving his life. Her desires only intensifies when she gets a crush on him, leading her to trade her voice for legs. And then, after a plot-heavy second half, it is Ariel's still burning desire to live on land that convinces King Triton to grant her wish, allowing her to live on land permanently, a happy ending for Ariel. Therefore, to represent the conception, development, and accomplishment of Ariel's dream, Part of Your World is sung at each crucial moment of that aspiration. This kind of reprise is often used as the theme for the emotional through line of a story. But it's not just the princesses, the supporting cast also gets to enjoy reprises from time to time. Like Mother Gothel and her villain song, Mother Knows Best. In the first act, it is a subtle way to manipulate Rapunzel by making her believe that she won't survive without Gothel, and that Gothel is just being the kind mother who looks out to her daughter by keeping her locked up in a tower. The reprise, though, is much more aggressive in its manipulation. It directly attacks Rapunzel's judgment and explicitly ridicules her, as a way to convince Rapunzel that she has been wrong about everything, and that Gothel no longer wants to lend an ear when Rapunzel finds herself heartbroken, which Gothel promises she will. Notice something? All of these reprises contain some kind of development. No matter how good a number is, if its only job is to heighten the emotional intensity of one singular moment and has no narrative purpose carried forward, it is not worth a reprise. And if the reprise only job is to reinstate what the first version already adequately said, then it's not worth the screen time. When pieced together, all the versions of a reprise piece must track a subplot on its own, with each version pinpointing an event in its development. But how does this relate to Elisabeth? Elisabeth the Musical is told by song all the way through, and it relies on reprises to tell and help the audience keep track of its 100 different subplots and character arcs. Let's take this iconic song with an equally iconic instrumental introduction sung by none other than Elisabeth's lover.
Der Tod. Was hat es zu bedeuten, dies alte Lied, das mir seit jenen Zeiten die Brust durchglüht? Engel nennen's Freude, Teufel nennen's Pein, Menschen meinen, es muss Liebe sein.
But wait. This probably isn't the version of the song you hear a lot, right? Perhaps you already know it under a different title, in a different context?
Es ist ein altes Thema, doch neu für mich. Zwei, die dieselbe lieben, nämlich dich. Du hast dich entschieden, ich hab dich verpasst. Bin auf deiner Hochzeit nur der Gast.
Feel like something's missing? Perhaps you're thinking of this version too.
Der Puls,
es geht schon besser.
Die Stirn ist heiß.
Es fehlt mir nichts.
Der Lied hat beinahe weiß. Wenn ich mich nicht irre und ich irre nie, ist dies die gewisse Melodie.
The first time this melody appears is right at the prologue, where the decidedly unreliable narrator Luigi Lucchini is trying to justify why he assassinated Elisabeth. And to lend his case some credibility, he evokes the figure Death, who testifies his love story with Elisabeth. The second time it comes up is at a point in the story when Death, having had one interaction with Elisabeth, where she reaches out to him, has come to terms with the idea that he too desires her. However, upon finding out about her marriage to Franz Josef, he is bitter by how she has already chosen before he could get back to her, though he declares that eventually she will come seeking him once more, seeing how she has already invited him to her wedding, kick-starting decades of pursuit and rejection. Which eventually reaches its climax when Franz Josef betrays Elisabeth with his infidelity, and Death comes back to make his final case. It fails, and he ceases to pursue her emotionally, thus the melody never appears again. Put all together, it is a story told in 3 parts: introduction, or conceptualization, development, and resolution. Another great example of how effectively reprises are used in Elisabeth to tell a subplot is Nichts ist schwer and Boote in der Nacht.
Nichts ist schwer, solange du bei mir bist. Wenn ich dich hab, gibt es nichts, was unerträglich ist. Wir begegnen uns auf dem Weg und oft fällt der Abschied uns schwer. Warum wird uns das Glück so schwer gemacht?
The song debuts right after Franz Josef and Elisabeth first meet, and are both young and crazily in love. In it, they swear to disregard everything else just to be with each other, a promise that would make them both miserable. especially Elisabeth, as shown in Bote in der Nacht, as they are both old, damaged, having been separated for years. It reflects the deterioration of Elisabeth and Franz Josef's marriage, from bright, hopeful naivete to sorrowful, bitter loneliness. Interestingly, Franz Josef is the one who begins and leads Nicht ich wer, while Elisabeth seems to reply to his words, but it is Elisabeth who begins and leads Bote in der Nacht, implying that their relationship was initiated by Franz Josef, but Elisabeth initiated their separation. Every powerful moment in Elisabeth is reprised with a development of the established point, subplot, or character arc. Elisabeth mach all mein Engel is reprised many times. Kitsch, Lucani's aria, is reprised. Ich gehöre nur mir, of course, is reprised, even as part of another song. Every single one of these reprises track a new change, growth, or development. They never repeat only what the first or main version has already said. They must pinpoint a different part in the story, or in the example of Kitsch, show the flip side of a social phenomenon as a meta-commentary. By now, everyone in the Elisabeth fandom and their mothers would have known about the forever controversial addition to the first act of Viennese Elisabeth from 2012 onwards, named Kein Kommen ohne Gehen. This song, which has Death singing about how he has loved Elisabeth at first sight and will continue to pursue her after letting her live, was notably not part of the original Viennese production, not even the Viennese revival. It was actually under the name Crimes of Rondo, popularized as part of the Takarazuka Revue's production from very early on in the 1990s. And it was added most likely to reinforce the idea that Elisabeth and Death's love affair is a fairy tale magical romance between an edgy prince and an innocent princess. And while it is catchy, I do believe that its addition to the composition of the show, and the Elisabeth and Death subplot more specifically, is not only unnecessary but even detrimental to what the show stands for. So let's get into it. Elisabeth's name is evoked countless times in the prologue, but her first appearance is in the second number, Vitu. In the song, a young Elisabeth attempts to ask her father to take her fishing or hunting with him, or just to let her play by herself so she doesn't have to participate in the extremely boring and stifling family get-together. In it, she also expresses an admiration for his bohemian-esque lifestyle that she desperately wishes to be a part of.
Mama hat heute Abend Gäste, das wird grauenhaft. All die Onkel und die Tanten kommen her. Und ich könnte mich drücken vor dem Klatsch und dem Getue. Doch die Gouvernante lässt es nicht zu. Vater, warum kann ich denn nicht mit dir gehen?
Weil es nicht geht.
Alles, was dir Spaß macht, mag ich fast noch mehr.
In diesem Fall, es geht nicht.
Träumen und Gedichte schreiben oder reiten mit dem Wind. Ich möchte mal so sein wie du.
But her efforts fail and she tries to hide from it all by climbing a tall tree, from which she falls. A near-fatal accident, the pastel colors vanish, parting way for cold blue darkness and a lone figure one may recognize as Death, also in blue, as opposed to the white he has donned in the prologue, carrying Elisabeth back to bed, effectively back to the world of the living. But there is something electric in their interaction, and as Death begins to walk away, Elisabeth reaches out and sings.
Wohin gehst du, schwarzer Prinz, warum bleibst du nicht hier? Ich hab mich in deinen Armen wohlgefühlt. Ich spürte eine Sehnsucht, mich von allem zu befreien. Wie ein schwarzer Vogel, stolz und allein. Ja, ich weiß, du bist der Tod und alle fürchten dich. Sie fantasiert Doch ich denke an dich, was immer ich auch tu.
Sie redet wie ihr Vater.
Träumen und Gedichte schreiben oder reiten mit dem Wind. Sie fiebert. Niemand versteht mich so wie du. Ist schon gut, Sissi.
Notice something? It's the same music. Schwarzer Prinz, a song about Elisabeth reaching out to death, is a reprise of V2, a song about Elisabeth reaching out to her father. This melody is even further established to be heavily associated to what she admires in her father when it is sung as she mourns for his death and regrets that she is now made of stone, never to lead the life he once did.
Leben frei wie ein Zigeuner mit der Zither unterm Arm. Nun ist es zu spät.
Adieu, Sissi.
Jetzt bin ich aus Stein. Nie werde ich so sein wie du.
But Schwarzer Prinz isn't directed at Elisabeth's father, or even his ghost. It's directed at death. In this moment, Elisabeth eclipses the absolutely independent and perhaps even lonely death with the image of her father. Here's a figure who, from her point of view, fished her from the pool of the may soon be dead and, at the same time, embodies the independent life she has always longed for. He is the projection of her desires. It's important to note that although Max appears to love Elisabeth very much, he always seems to keep her at arm's length, his lifestyle just out of her reach. Neglected, she latches on to death, the same way her son is shown to do exactly one act later, striking an unmistakable parallel between the two.
Ach, Mama, ich möchte immer bei dir sein. Da fährst du fort, nimmst du mich nicht mit.
Thus, although Elisabeth is singing to death, the song's focus is on her. It reveals more about her than anyone else. It is clear that her psychology, such as issues with her parents and her aspiration, pushes her to reach out and take the initiative, beginning this 50-year-long affair. It also hints at Sisi's own fascination with the melancholic, which kept her dancing with death like no other has. So what are the consequences of disrupting a sequence exploring Elisabeth's psychology with a guy singing about falling in love with her at first sight?
ただの少女のはずなのに俺のすべてが崩れるたった一人の人間なのに俺を震えさせる
First, let's get one thing out of the way. Some productions of Elisabeth by the Takarazuka Revue kept a very, very brief, heavily cut down form of Schwarzer Prinz, but only in response and reaction to Rondo. I do not consider this a faithful or acceptable translation of Schwarzer Prinz because not only has the substance been sucked dry, as with the case of many songs from this musical, the context is also vastly different. Hence, to me, the inclusion of Rondo comes at the cost of Schwarzer Prinz. There are 4 factors of this show that I believe were most affected by such inclusion, especially where it is placed. I call them number 1, the Elisabeth Problem, number 2, the Death Problem, number 3, the Elisabeth X Death Problem, and finally, the Composition Problem. As mentioned in the previous section, Schwarzer Prinz is one of Elisabeth's early character establishing moments. It is where hints of her fierce, bordering careless desire to be free and her persistent melancholia can first be seen. What I find interesting is that between the 1992 Viennese production and the Viennese revival, lyrics have been changed, but while the overall idea and context remain the same, They express Elisabeth's desire and her interpretation of death at that point differently.
Bist du verletzt? Mama, wenn ich älter werde, such mir keinen Mann.
Sie fantasiert.
Alles, was mich glücklich macht, kann ich allein.
Sie redet wie ihr Vater.
Träumen und Gedichte schreiben oder reiten mit dem Wind. Sie lieben, ich möchte nie sein. Ist schon.
In the 1992 Viennese, it is unclear whether Elisabeth is specifically reaching out to death or if seeing him inspires in her the sense that all she loves to do she can do alone, unconstrained by societal expectation such as getting a husband. In the Viennese revival, however, Elisabeth directly addresses death, onto whom she projects that desire to be free, thus revealing her persistent melancholia and fascination with darkness, while also implying that she finds it comforting to be alone, free of human attachment, just like how she sees him. It is somber, more cynical than V2, as shown in the way the music takes a darker tone and the lighting is cold and blue.
Es ist Liebe. Per Dio.
By removing Schwarzer Prinz at this point, they remove Elisabeth's agency, and more importantly, her psychological exploration. Although short, Schwarzer Prinz presents all the ingredients that would slowly be boiled in a pot through subsequent events like the wedding, der letzte Tanz, the training of the young empress, disappointment in Franz Josef, to lead to the delightful and exquisite dish that is the defining character moment, her ultimate I Want song, Ich gehöre nur mir.
Und willst du mich finden, dann halt mich nicht fest. Ich geb meine Freiheit nicht her. Und willst du mich binden, verlass ich dein Nest und tauch wie ein Vogel ins Meer.
Without the padding of Schwarzer Prinz, V2 is just a cute song a girl sings to her father, and Ich gehöre nur mir is just an unprompted prima donna solo and the promotional tune of the show. Both the subplot of Elisabeth's unhinged thirst for freedom and her persistent depression need Schwarzer Prinz to act as the connective tissue, and both are severely weakened without it, resulting in Takarazuka's Elisabeth, or Zukabeth, to move around her own show like a cardboard cutout, without motives, without depth, without exploration, in a musical that is conceptualized as an exploration about the person Elisabeth might have been. The depiction of her desire to be free is only based on a shallow understanding of her childlike self-portrayal in V2 and assuming that's all there is to her, not realizing, or perhaps intentionally erasing, the fact that she is trying to get her father to defend her and dismiss her governess here, and is very upset when he wouldn't do so, showing a level of emotional complexity. Clearly, the Takarazuka actress wasn't given the right direction, even if the translation of the lyrics follows the original German fairly closely. Meanwhile, her depression can pretty much be summed up as Sad Girl Elisabeth, which is a gross injustice to both the Viennese reimagination and her real-life counterpart. And when build-ups like these are cut, the cathartic highs are dampened. If Elisabeth has hardly demonstrated a deeply personal but burning dream to be unrestrained, unburdened, independent, even if lonely, then her pushback against chains and locks symbolized by the imperial household is baseless and weak. When we haven't a clue about Elisabeth's personality, it packs less of a punch when she is behaving, well, like herself, just more dramatically and powerfully. Removing crucial setups, build-ups, and character-establishing moments screws over their triumphant moments too, and you really don't want to do that with the woman whose name is the title of the show. But speaking of character moments, guess who else is also majorly screwed over by removing Schwarzer Prinz? That's right, it's her poor little meow meow son Rudolph. I said before that both Elisabeth and Rudolph experience some form of neglect from a parent they see themselves in and desperately want but fail to connect with, resulting in them bonding with death instead. This is really important because it's basically the pathos behind Rudolph's plea to Elisabeth, asking her to convince Franz Josef to not make a big deal out of his involvement with liberal journalism. Liberal journalism that he knows she would be sympathetic to. But because she is so high up her own ego and so comfortable with thinking of herself as lonely and misunderstood, she rejects her son.
Mein Liebe lebt der Sparen und dieser Ihnen der Skandal. Nur wenn du für mich beim Kaiser bittest, ist es noch nicht zu spät. Dem Kaiser bin ich längst entglitten, hab alle Fesseln durchgeschnitten. Ich bitte nie, ich tu's auch nicht für dich.
It is a devastating turn of events, because as the audience, we have been shown the clear parallel between the two. Elisabeth, at that point, is just too egotistical to see that. When I first watched the show in the Takarazuka version, I was so confused as to why Rudolph would claim that he and his mother are mirrors of each other, because the parallel has been destroyed when they cut out Schwarzer Prinz in favor of Rondo, along with other instances of Elisabeth interacting and even bonding with death. So great, you dampened your eponymous character's arc and wrecked her son's. Who else can you screw up? Well, you're not gonna like it, but...
愛と死のロンドン
The role of death in the original and revival Viennese musical is a commonly disputed one, as he is an ambiguous character with unclear motives for his actions. Is he actually the bringer of death? Does he symbolize Elisabeth's depression and suicidal thoughts? Is he despair in disguise of a sweet face? Does he actually play a part in the story, or is he a character, constructed by Lucheni as the latter tries to explain himself? Or is Lucheni really just his henchman? And to all of them, I say, yes. Despite the ambiguity surrounding the character's motives, agency, and role, there are a few main factors that remain consistent throughout the story. Number 1, he appears during physical or emotional limbo and either puts someone to rest or not. But the decision is his, not anyone else's. Number 2, he is not morally constrained by human morality, thus is neither good nor bad. And third, his impact is permanent and devastating. He is not evil, but his consequences are cruel. So okay, hear me out. Rondo actually contradicts every consistent characterization of death. Rondo is Zuka Death's song, is just about him, front and center. Elisabeth is just a pretty prop, which by the way also diminishes the other better death motive de letzte Tanz, and this goes against everything that makes death his character. Let's look at the context of the song again. It comes after Elisabeth's big fall from that misadventure of trying to get away from the governess, and now she's in limbo, right? Right. In the Viennese production, Death is shown to be already on his way to return Elisabeth. Depending on the actor, he might sometimes jokingly try to kiss her and she leans away, sometimes he might just offer a reassuring smile. Overall, it doesn't appear as though he is seriously trying to take her life at that point, meaning a decision has already been made. She will live, is his decision. And if he decides it's time for someone to die, it's impossible to try and convince him otherwise. But for now, she lives. He does his job dutifully and returns her to the world of the living, but she reaches out and catches his attention. The sequence doesn't allow room for Death to have a mopey 4-minute-long song about how Elisabeth looks so pretty in limbo, lying in his arm, lying on her bed, so in order to slot that in, they had to rewrite the scene. And the setup for Rondo goes like this.
Elisabeth, な世界私を返してその瞳が胸を焦がし眼差しが突き刺さる
See something wrong? Zuka Death appears before Zuka Beth in limbo. He calls her to join the underworld, thus implying that he has already made a decision. But then she willfully screams, "No, I don't want to die, return me!" And somehow that softens his heart and makes him change his mind? Oh, and he also falls in love with her, and I only have a few questions. First of all, is Elisabeth the first person who has ever not wanted to die? I don't want to sound controversial, but I think not wanting to be worm food is a fairly common human experience, is it not? Why is Elisabeth any special at all by not wanting to die? Even worse yet, from the perspective that death is the personification of her depression and suicidal thought, the fact that he keeps plaguing her entire life, showing that she does want to die. Multiple times. She just chooses to rise above it. Secondly, is death just that easy to persuade? Like, can somebody just say, "No, I want to live," and death would just go, "Hey, understandable, have a nice day"? If so, why doesn't Elisabeth's daughters or mother or sister or father or son just refuse to die? Do they not want to live enough, or does it have to be a pretty girl? See, the major problem with this setup is that it diminishes Death's power and presence greatly. He comes off as extremely indecisive, persuadable, and forms attachment way too easily, the latter also contradicting the idea that he is the proud and alone blackbird that Elisabeth aspires to be. He is no longer a deific figure, an intangible idea, or a concept that no matter how hard people may try, they can never truly escape. And now he's just a guy who's flashy with a dozen henchmen, a guy who moves around as though he's the hottest shit, but is never actually that consequential. He is not human in the way that he can express emotions or desires, like the way Mate Camaras plays him, but in a material, mundane, and mortal way. Frankly, Zuka Death is not that different from Franz Josef. And because of the way Zuka Beth is set up to be the ingenue the audience is supposed to pity, and she herself places a formal request not to die, Zuka Death's change of mind to let her live is framed as inherently a good deed, which forces the idea that death, an omnipresent deific figure and a personified concept, is somehow accessible on a human morality scale. And while yes, Viennese death makes everyone miserable and his actions may have cruel effects on somebody, that's only because we as humans form attachment to those who will eventually be past tense. It's both a blessing and a curse. He is just doing his job. By making him do a good thing, it lessens the impact of his actions and make the concept he is based on extremely wobbly. Additionally, as mentioned before, Death's impact is permanent and devastating, and while he doesn't collect Elisabeth here, his appearance does evoke a kind of fascination in her. This fascination is the same as him actively trying to woo her and have her, but it represents the beginning of Elisabeth being trapped in a vicious loop between too miserable and too familiar with the misery to actually try and escape it. That is the permanent and devastating impact of their encounter. Because Zuka Beth never reaches out to Zuka Death the same way, their interaction throughout the show is painfully one-sided, consisting of only him going, "You're so beautiful, I can't believe a mere human girl can make me feel this way, I will let you live and pursue you forever," and her going, "Cool, thanks for letting me live, bro." In essence, Rondo demystifies death and makes him nothing short of Prince Charming in black. He is indecisive, easily swayed, constrained by human morality, and overall, just a guy in a Jareth the Goblin King cosplay. When watching Viennese Elisabeth, you are always reminded that the only constant in life is death. And Rondo contradicts that. Rondo effectively downgraded both of these characters massively, so is it really a surprise when it results in the wishy-washy Prince Charming and Cinderella romance, but edgy? I mentioned before that Elisabeth taking death as a lover has complex psychological implication. On a surface level, he symbolizes her grief and depression and suicidal thoughts. There are even songs where he explicitly reflects her turmoil back at her. You look a little closer and see that there is something in death that Elisabeth does find aspirational, as she wonders if he is the state of absolute freedom and independence. And on a more abstract level, the relationship between Elisabeth and death might even imply a certain familiarity and comfort in darkness, sadness, and misery. She is miserable for it, sure, but she's been steeped in it for so long it feels like an old friend, a lover. She is unwilling to break out of her darkness to help her son because that would mean accepting the connection with somebody and share a mutual understanding with one another. She refuses to bond with Franz Josef even after all they've been through because, quite frankly, she looks down on him and believes that he can never empathize with her. Elisabeth thinks she is the only one who is sad and thus pushes everyone away. And I'm not saying that she is a bitch and a terrible person for this, but sometimes depression really gets you distant and defensive. Many people have been there. Elisabeth is comfortable with the misery because it allows her to prioritize herself, disregarding everything and everyone. Death is a cruel lover, but he is her lover, and that idea defines their dynamic, one with push and pull, power play, desperation, and vulnerability. Something she continuously withholds from Franz Josef. It's primal and instinctual. Their interactions are rarely tender. They bite, they claw, they tear away each other's facades and rip off each other's defenses, and yet they both can't help but be tangled up into each other. It's not a love story between two people, but one between a person and her own psyche. They are enemies and lovers without hopes of a happy ending, only closure and catharsis. However, this relationship is massively changed by the diminishing of both characters' personalities. Elisabeth isn't the one who takes the initiative and reaches out first, hence her side of the love affair is never explored. Throughout the show, she is just a girl being chased. It is painfully one-sided. Even in Viennese view, she isn't the one to look for death in the crowd, to boast about her ability to charm an entire country and how she feels empowered from such endeavor. It is him who crashes her celebration. He pursues her. He invites her to duet with him. It is never her. She never takes any step towards him. It is so one-sided, you start to wonder, what is so special about her? Does she actually matter in this relationship? There is no apparent interest from Elisabeth. The relationship is just one guy popping into her room randomly. And speaking of whom, thanks to Rondo, Death's motivation makes absolutely no sense.
お前の命奪う代わり生きたお前に愛されたいんだ禁じられた愛のタブーに
sings about how she is so lively and vibrant that it would be a shame to kill her, and that he wants to be loved by her while she is still alive, which, again, objectively, is not a bad thing, almost a very, let's say, noble deed. But it doesn't explain why he keeps bugging her and trying to make her his, aka kill herself. Like, brother, do you not know what you do? Do you not know who you are? Why are you constantly, violently, aggressively pursuing her at any given chance if you want her alive? Just kick back and judge Franz Josef and throw popcorns with her or something. That's a more surefire way to her alive heart. You can't want her both alive and dead. She's not Schrodinger's cat pre-unboxing. Also, if Death just wants to be loved by her, how does this at all conflict Elisabeth's desire to be free? In the Viennese production, she is clearly attracted to him. They even get along sometimes, but her ambition of wanting to be free contradicts his goal of wanting her to die. Thus, the constant rejections she throws at him. But Zuka Beth doesn't have this weighing on her. Zuka Death explicitly states that he doesn't want her to die. It seems like he just can't control himself around her. So why can't she just have a lover with magic taking her flying around the world? Just be careful not to kiss him. Oh, and to add insult to the wound, in the end, after her assassination, she doesn't actually die. She's just going to fly up to heaven and spend happily ever after with him. With Death. If Death is such a happy ending, why doesn't she just die all those other times? Needless to say, this is one of the few happy endings that gets me spinning into a raging void. The implication that maybe killing yourself is a good solution to life's problem after all, and Elisabeth is such a foolishly willful little girl for not succumbing to it earlier. What an absolute joke! Furthermore, the fact that Crimes of Rondo is technically the first I Want song of the show, as it precedes Ich gehöre nur mir by a mile, means that the ultimate goal of the show is now for Death and Elisabeth to get together. Thus, anything or anyone that interferes with that goal is an obstacle to overcome. In other words, Elisabeth's constant rejection of Death is no longer symbolic of her rejecting her own suicidal thoughts, but rather a difficulty obstructing that goal. Hence, Elisabeth is not only portrayed as spineless, foolish, and naive, but even framed as the antagonist of her own show for the sin of not wanting to unalive herself.
お前の愛を勝ち得るまで愛と死のロンドン
I know this video is already long enough, but I swear, this is the last point, and it's going to be short, but it is a crucial one. As discussed earlier in this essay, Elisabeth is told through a lot of reprises and leitmotif to denote and track changes and development. So if they had decided to take the thunder away from the Tanz in favor of Rondo, then surely it must be better at developing Death, right? No. The problem is, Rondo was composed as a standalone work, with little connective tissue to the story, as opposed to Viennese, for example, which was also added later but follows the story, ideas, and themes already presented and developed throughout. So it doesn't kill the show even if opinions regarding its addition may vary. But Rondo is just Death moping about how Elisabeth is so beautiful and makes him shiver. And every subsequent reprise, still the same, still in love, still moping about how she wouldn't give in. Somehow somebody decided that he should totally intrude on Elisabeth's crowning moment, the self-empowering ballad, to soil the mood with his whines. Like, it's great that the protagonist is finding her footing and rising up against her oppressive surroundings, but Death hasn't appeared for like 5 minutes now, and we need him in every song, even if it completely contradicts what his character is supposed to represent. Like, despair, And here he is, making one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in the entire show, Elisabeth crying at Rudolph's coffin, into his self-indulgent little solo. What a completely appropriate moment to steer the story into a sappy, corny love ballad. Like, I'm sorry, your son killed himself, and you're probably feeling very guilty for not being there for him when he needed you, but you know what's more important? Loving me! One of the reasons I like the De Let's the Tanz trilogy is because you can see the changes in Death's approach and attitude towards his relationship with Elisabeth. He tries to conceptualize and contemplate it in prologue. He is filled with bitterness and jealousy in De Let's the Tanz, then he comes back roaring, expecting a long-awaited victory in Maladie. After that final rejection, he turns cold and refuses her at Rudolph's grave. But Rondo? Rondo has zero change and zero consequence because it was never connected to the plot, the structure, or the theme of the show. It exists purely as Death's little vanity project and to remind every audience member whose merch they should be buying when they exit the theater. And to have this song, this shallow, uninteresting, kitschy song as not only your representative, your promotional material, but your title hurts everybody. It hurts Franz Josef, Rudolph, Elisabeth, Death, Kunze, Lieve, me, everybody. I have said before that I do not wish to perform any in-depth analysis on the culture of Takarazuka Revue and its fandom, but I think at this point it's important to think about the possible reason why a change that was so obviously bad structurally and detrimental to the theme, story, and characters was made in the first place. And while yes, it is an attempt to steer the story into a romantic direction, as Fitzroy argue in their essay titled The Boyfriend-Death Problem, I think there is also an institutional obligation when it comes to writing shows for the Takarazuka Revue concerning the role of the leading man and the leading lady. So the revue has 5 troupes, and it organizes all of its actresses into otokoyaku and musumeyaku. Literal translation meaning man role and girl role, and each of the troupe has 2 lead actresses picked from those roles. The top otokoyaku is called a top star. She gets the lead in every single major production until she leaves the revue. She is also the face of the troupe. She's on every promotional material. Meanwhile, the top musumeyaku is just a top musumeyaku. She has a flat functional role in most cases I've seen on and off stage. In promotional materials, she is the tiny dancing lady in the back, while the top star takes up like 70% of the frame. And from my observations, she also gets less merchandises than the top star. On stage, she frequently, not always, bless Ueda Kumiko, has to act as the proxy through which the presumably female-identifying audience can insert themselves into the story and fantasize about being surrounded by gorgeous male-identifying characters, especially the one played by the top star. So while adapting Viennese Elisabeth into the institution of the Takarazuka Revue, they probably ran into a bit of an issue. If you've seen that video, Elisabeth the Musical, but it's only Death/the thought scenes, you might know that Death only appears on stage for about 33 minutes in the Viennese productions, maybe even less prior to the addition of Wenn ich tanzen will. That's only about a quarter of the show, and that's because he is not the protagonist of Elisabeth the Musical. Elisabeth is. And that's a problem for the Takarazuka Revue because the most leading man-looking role, Death, certainly has to go to the top star, but if the top star only appears for a quarter of the show, then how can we ensure that people will buy top star merch? Which is why I think they decided to give him a song that would steer the story towards Death more than Elisabeth. Then they also inserted several reprises and inserted him into scenes that he really isn't supposed to be in, all to give Death more stage time. And at this point, more than Elisabeth, since they also cut some of her songs and altered the rest to give her even less stage time. Not only that,
Because the stage has to organize itself around the top star, there are scenes where even if Death is there, he should be so minor. But no, he's the center now. He has the spotlight. Like, dude, what are you doing there? This is supposed to be her moment, her rising above her depression, which is you. You should be way back there. This isn't supposed to be about you. But I guess after years of being associated with Aitoshi no Rondo, Elisabeth the Musical is no longer about Elisabeth. It's about some guy named Todd now.
Und wenn ich einmal sterben muss, dann legt mich an den Strand, dass auch mein letzter Blick noch sei aufs teure Meer gewandt. Die Wogen rauschen mir dazu den letzten lieben Laut, als rief voll Sehnsucht schon zu sich der Bräutigam die Braut. Und wo am tiefsten ist das Meer, dort senkt mich dann hinein. Mag's oben stürmen noch so sehr, da und wird Ruhe sein.